Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. I'm Jason.
And I'm Steve.
And Steve is a licensed marriage and family therapist with over 30 years experience. And I'm a guy who, like some of the listeners, is looking to understand love and relationships a little better. How does that sound?
That sounds really good. If I seem a little empty-headed, it was because we were discussing sports just before this podcast. I am not a sports guy. And so it's like there's just a big blank place in my brain where I have no sports knowledge at all.
Yeah. Well, I won't ask you about any.
Well, let's get back to relationships then.
So how this works is I present a topic to Steve, which I have planned ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so. And today's topic is the sacred bubble. And before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so stay tuned for that. And I also want to say, if you enjoy the podcast and find the information helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends and family. And if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider leaving a review. We really appreciate that.
Well, yeah, we do. So
it helps.
You don't have to say nice things, but I like to be liked.
Yes. And it feeds the algorithm. So we're trying to feed that machine so it bumps us up.
Oh, is that how it works?
Yeah. So the more people who subscribe, the more people who share it, the more people who listen, the more people who comment, it becomes more of a thing, So,
well, then I would pitch it like this. If you're getting anything out of these podcasts and it's helping you in relationships or to think things through, and you'd like other people to have the same advantage, I would encourage you to leave a little review for that reason. Let's help that algorithm.
Yeah. Great. The sacred bubble. So a lot of people probably don't know what this is about. It's something I've heard Steve mention a few times, but I don't fully understand what it is. So I just thought in regards to managing love intelligently, it sounds like an important piece that can help people in relationships and marriages kind of form a deeper connection or union with one another. However, I don't really understand how it all is. So I'll let you explain what you mean by this concept.
Well, it's not a term I use every week, but I did just happen to use it this last week. And I was talking to a couple who struggle with their conflicts because they get into an argument and then it's as if they sort of fall under the law of the jungle rule. And so somebody has to win, but somebody has to lose. And somebody's going to walk away from this argument with hurt feelings, and somebody's going to be feeling great, like they really dominated the field. And I just instead offered them this different reframe, if you will, where there's a sacred bubble around their relationship because their relationship is sacred, and that together they are called upon as the executives on the board of directors to solve the problem in the flow of the production of the only thing worth producing in a marriage, and that would be happiness. Yes, there can be kids and there can be wealth and there can be things like that. But really why we get together with one another is to produce happiness. And if one of us is unhappy, there's a problem. Even if the other one is supremely happy or has no cause for alarm whatsoever. He's thinking, she loves this marriage and she loves our sex life and she loves our finances out here in the jungle. Whatever it is whatever the issue is, the idea is that we are the team who can solve all those problems and that all of life's problems lie outside of that sacred entity known as us. Mm-hmm. So it removes some of the personal sting from the argument and instead puts the focus on problem solving. And sometimes, of course, the problem to be solved is nobody's listening to me and I just want to be heard. And that's a fairly straightforward one to solve. But that too is part of the problems that are outside our sacred bubble. And solving that problem is sometimes bewildering to people. It takes years for some people to figure out, oh, he or she doesn't need me to fix their problem. They just need me to listen. And that's a great thing to realize. But all problems are kind of like that. If you think about it, whether it's her work, his work, the relationships with the kids, the finances, their sex life, everything, even the most personal things, are outside of that bubble of the relationship. Couples who can't live by that kind of a metaphor really are rather doomed because they keep seeing each other as the enemy.
So this is making them see them as equals,
right?
As us, you said.
And as partners. Yeah, we're on the same team. I don't want to be on a team where I'm sacking my own quarterback. And that's the end of the sports metaphor for that.
Yeah, I was like, I thought we weren't getting into sports here.
Well, we were talking about sports. And I think that if we can just understand that the problem is not a commentary. It's not, she doesn't like living in this neighborhood and she thinks I'm an unworthy provider. Or he doesn't like what's happening with the kids and he thinks I'm a terrible mother. It's not he's unhappy and that is the problem. Let's solve that problem. She's unhappy. Let's solve that problem. And what would it take? What would it take for you to be happy? Well, what is it you're looking for? What would you like to see happen? And we start asking these questions and we come up with answers that may or may not be appealing. Really? That's all you need is just for me to listen to you? I had no idea it was that easy. Or really, you'd be okay if we just didn't go to craft fairs so often? I pick on craft fairs a lot, so yeah. Sorry.
No, I used to have to go to antique things with my mom and my sister, and it's kind of like a craft fair.
Pretty much, yeah. It's pretty much the same category.
Nothing but dread and horrible feelings came up when I was there. Like really pouted about it.
It would have been, you could have gotten over it if you just started knocking over some really expensive things.
Yeah.
With your little boy clumsiness. They might have left you at home then. But I think all of these problems, all human problems are capable of solution by humans. But it's really hard when we start getting subjective and put our little egos in there and we're really upset with each other instead of looking at the problem itself and, in a sense, objectifying the problem. The problem is not about you. It's not about me. It's our problem. And so even if I have to own the problem, I say, I have a bone to pick with you. Can we talk? And you pick the right time. And I personally take this very seriously. The metaphor I would use rather than a sports metaphor would be the metaphor of a corporate entity that's producing, let's say, widgets. And there's a breakdown in the production line and the board of directors gets together to solve the problem. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a production problem or a distribution problem or a sales problem, but whatever the problem is, the board just wants to solve the problem so they can get back to the business of making money. In a marriage or in an intimate, committed relationship, it's not about the money so much as it is the happiness. Mm-hmm. I think even the average person could be happy with less money if he was happy.
Yeah.
And so that's the only, the sacred bubble business is simply a metaphor to encourage people to remember why they got together in the first place, that they are a team, that the relationship is a sacred one. And then, there's a problem that follows right after that, because frankly, a lot of people get together with someone who's incapable of solving problems. Mm-hmm. And that is disappointing, but it's also good to figure out because it's a way of measuring whether or not we're actually in the right relationship. And if we're not in the right relationship today, can it be fixed so it can become the right relationship? And if it can't be fixed, well, then we need to, start splitting the sheets into different sets and move on.
Well, that's the thing. It's easier to do that when you're still in a dating phase with somebody.
Absolutely.
But what about the people so like this couple who came to you and you spoke to it, do people understand the concept? Are they able to?
Oh yeah. It's a sacred bubble. I mean, what's not to like about that? Yeah. It's sacred and it's a bubble. Super easy.
But the clients, they understand it. Cause I started thinking about when you said it about, cause it is like a business or corporation or board that comes together to solve the problems. But I also started thinking, well, boards are kind of messed up sometimes because it's like the people who are in the power have the ego and the power dynamics, and one person wants to always kind of rule, or they kind of could become the law of the jungle. So it needs to be a healthy operating board.
Absolutely, according to the rules, operating according to the rules of Hoyle or the Geneva Convention or something civilized rather than the law of the jungle. And so we're having this dispassionate conversation about the breakdown in whatever it is, the supply chain or the production or the sales. And we want to solve the problem. And it's hopefully like even in a business partnership between 2 or 3 people, hopefully it's not about the ego when we decide, well, we're going to advertise using the internet or radio or print mediums of some sort. Who cares as long as we can demonstrate what's effective? Mm-hmm. And so that's why you have to, I think, envision it as a sacred bubble where we can just detach from the problem and focus on the solution and join in on the board of directors meeting. Sacred bubble meaning, yeah, it's not a food fight, in high school where we're just throwing crap at each other. We are actually trying to solve this problem. Now, I have been in relationships where any dispassionate attempt to solve problems was treated as a message of, I don't care. Because if I really cared, I'd be yelling the way she's yelling. Yeah. Or I'd be pounding the table, or I would be doing something to demonstrate, my passion, because that is the only way we can show we care. Yeah. For some people, that is irrational and self-defeating. And of course, we can show we care by simply looking at someone in a caring manner and saying, no, I really do care about you. That's all it takes, at least for normal people. We don't have to turn into that old TV commercial about the Samsonite gorilla, start throwing things around and pounding on things, and beating things up to show that we really, really care.
But some people, though, that's how they like. Have you had somebody ever as a client who says, well, that's how I show it, or that's what I want him to show it? Have you had that?
Well, in my family, we're German, and that's how we roll, or we're Italian, or we're Gypsy, or we're whatever it is, Romani, we're whatever it is that they are. We're all redheads in my family, and everybody's got a myth about why they behave badly. That myth justifies the behavior. Is it like
a family myth? Or
yeah,
like a
cultural myth, a family myth. That's just how we are in this family, and that's how we've always been. But, that's absurd because we all have choices about our behavior. And there are some patterns of human behavior that are ultimately self-defeating. Just because all of my ancestors were alcoholics doesn't mean that's how we roll, and I have to be an alcoholic. And the same is true with all the other things that we do that are matters of choice. I don't have a choice about my sexual orientation, of course, or my sexual identity, but I have choices about a lot of my other behaviors. And I think when it comes to arguing, a lot of us argue still as if we are fighting some sort of a combat in a war, but it's simply because we haven't been educated about an abuse-free lifestyle that would enable us to treat each other respectfully and see if we can come to a common mind on different issues. And for people who aren't quite there yet, sometimes talking about a sacred bubble makes it a little bit easier to visualize.
Yeah. And then with that cultural change, though, that's like a difficult thing that people have to kind of like let go of, because it's almost like you could become an outcast from your family, maybe even if you start doing more healthy behaviors or start treating, just having a different life. It's
my family of origin, you mean? They might really be upset with that if I start changing and doing things a new way. But in my family, this is the great thing about being sexual beings, right? Because sexual beings come together and the two create a newness. They come together and reproduce and there's a genetic offspring who has many of their genes, but is also some new recombination of those genes. And we're always waging an ongoing war with viruses and bacteria to stay one step ahead of them, which, in comparison with something like a starfish that reproduces asexually and makes a perfect clone of itself. Well, all that needs to happen is something in the environment needs to change, and then the entire population gets wiped out. So, but the same thing happens emotionally and psychologically. The two of us come together, and the whole idea is we're going to learn some things from each other. We're going to start seeing the world not through a monocular vision anymore, but binocularly through the vision of two people who are standing in two different places, two different perspectives, typically male and female, man and woman. And we're seeing the world in startlingly different ways. And we have the privilege of listening to our partner, and that partner, if they can disclose and be honest and open with us and truly vulnerable, they tell us, well, that's not how they're experiencing it. Oh, how are you experiencing it? And then they relate a tale that we never would have imagined. I remember lecturing a group of romance writers of America. It's actually a trade group.
Why did they have you there?
Because I'm the expert on love. Okay. So I was explaining to them that men typically, as I've said before on this podcast, that when the women leave the room, we don't all celebrate by saying, oh, good, now we can finally talk about relationships. I said, men just don't care about the relationship. And these women were, as a group, I've never seen such an incredible reaction from such a sensitive group of people, because they were either at the point of tears or murder. Well, then why do we even try? Why are we writing this, stuff? And then I said, men don't care about relationships. They care about her. And it was like, wow. It never occurred to them that in their very careful gardening, in the care and maintenance of a relationship, that he might not really care about those details, but he might really care about her and whether or not she's happy.
Yeah.
Where it's a little bit like my wife and me, because I'm a gardener and I love gardening, and my wife loves my garden, and she's experiencing it from her chair with a drink with some ice in it. And I'm out there digging in the dirt. We're both enjoying the same entity, but I'm enjoying the nurturing and care of the garden, and she's enjoying the end result. It doesn't mean that she doesn't like gardens.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that men don't like relationships. We enjoy them. We just don't have the same level of keen interest that women do in all of the fine nuances and details, typically, except for guys like me who are pretty much, bisexual? I don't know. Because this is my profession, and I'm fascinated by relationships and human behavior. Yeah. But part of that comes from a very traumatic background, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. But if a man could just coast along and bliss and enjoy a great relationship, that makes sense to me. And when we talk about this kind of thing, other people more intelligent than myself have pointed out that men don't really seem to have much regard for relationships. And then the question is posed, then why would women keep trying to get us to talk about the relationships? Well, because we're not equally good at this. Yeah. Men are really good at lots of things and take tremendous satisfaction in those things. I think I take tremendous satisfaction in helping have healthy relationships, but I don't have my wife's level of patience in discerning and going over the atomistically tiny details of a conversation. And she does. And that's why I can't talk to her or be her friend. Instead, I insist that she has girlfriends and that she talk to her sister. And my wife, who will be listening to this, she'll laugh when I say, because I always bottom line. Could you just bottom line it for me, honey? Is your mom still mad at you or not? Is your sister happy or not? And she'll say, yeah, she's happy. Oh, okay, great. And then I'm ready to turn the page. I don't really need to to go on with.
So you don't like getting into those small little details of it all.
Yeah, and then my mom said to me, and I said to my mom, and then she said, and then,
Okay.
then I can't even do that in my office. I tell my clients, you got to stop talking. It's just driving me crazy.
So that's what you mean about men don't want to talk about relationships. They don't want to.
Right. They don't really care about relationships as judged by women's standard of caring. If we use a woman's standard of caring in general, and I know there are women who are as atavistic as I am, who don't care about relationships either. But in general, I think women do care, as is evidenced by the so-called, and I guess it's somewhat pejorative, chick flick or chick lit, where it's all about the relationships.
Yeah.
And for guys, it's really more about how many people get machine gunned to death and how fun that is and how cleansing. We've talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
That is my idea of a spa cleanse.
So if people are having trouble in their relationship and they take this idea of the sacred bubble, like what if someone listened to this and they're like, hey, I heard this podcast, sacred bubble. We are in a bubble together. And like, I guess, what do you mean by sacred? Like, what does sacred mean to you?
Well, sacred for me means set apart. And for my clients who are religious,
set apart is
what sacred means. And the word sacred, set apart from ordinary everyday living. So this is a sacred book, whether it's the Quran or the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or anything, and anything like that. And for my religious clients, it's a helpful metaphor. And for my non-religious clients, I think it's helpful, but it's not, I think if I were listening to this by myself and I thought it was an idea that would help my relationship, I would probably pitch it like an idea to my partner and say, would you be interested in looking at our fights as if we were in a sacred bubble?
And she's like, well, what does that mean?
And what I mean by that,
what do you mean by that? Steve.
And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, all of our problems, no matter how personal they seem, and no matter how much they have hurt one or the other of us, they're really outside of us, that we have an enduring entity that is us, and that we will endure together, and we will solve these problems because they are fleeting and transitory, whereas we as a couple are enduring.
But she's like, well, I'm really pissed that you did that. So then that's
that you listened to that podcast without me.
Yeah. So that would be her taking it personally and not setting it apart. Like, you need to put those things on the outside and not.
Yeah. And that's why I brought it up. You have to pitch it because it has to be engaged in deliberately and consensually. You can't impose this on someone. You could say, unilaterally, I believe that you and I are in a sacred bubble and that all of our problems are outside of us. And I just want you to be happy. And I think the two of us, if we work together, we could solve whatever problem there is out there. But I need you to not attack me, but to remember that I'm in the bubble with you. We're on the same team.
And then, so why would you say this is important to people?
I think, again, because people get into this law of the jungle sort of thinking where it's a debate, and it's at a debate, there's going to be a winner and a loser. And at the end, it's about the ideas and it's the principle of the thing and the who's right and who's wrong. And that's a way of looking at problems. And I think that the foundation of that approach is a strong belief that it's important to find out who's to blame. Yeah. And I think finding out who's to blame is the most powerful of dead ends, the deadest of dead ends, because it takes us nowhere. Even if I grudgingly admit, okay, that was my fault, I'm sorry, now I'm not happy. Yeah. Is anybody really, satisfied with that resolution of the so-called problem? Because the problem isn't usually. It has nothing to do with assessing of blame.
Yeah. But so I guess, like, how would you then differentiate? So it's like, okay, you have two ways. You could do law of the jungle fighting or a sacred bubble.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm assuming the sacred bubble is going to lead to a better connection, or it's going to be more equal, or there's going to, and that is going to then allow for the love to flourish or the relationship to go
Absolutely,
deeper
because
into intimacy.
sure, because now I'm not attacking my partner. You did that wrong, or what the hell were you thinking? That kind of stuff. And instead,
so it protects even abuse. Like we talk about abuse, it's almost like part of the abuse-free life.
Yeah, she is a sacred part of this sacred bubble. We're both sacred within this bubble, and we, that phrase, "holy matrimony," kind of applies. What's sacred about it isn't just that we're not supposed to have sex with other people. What's sacred about it is that we are together as a couple and as a team. The two of us, are a family. And so we can pursue who's to blame, but that's now we're each going to be attacking the other. And I would say that's the hallmark of the opposite approach. And the more helpful approach is always, and every family therapist I know who's worthy of the money is somebody who's focusing on the solution rather than who's to blame, at least for normal couples.
Yeah.
Now, if you married somebody who's mentally ill, I think it's important to find out who's to blame. Because, when you have somebody who's mentally ill, all bets are off, because the whole concept of mental illness is that it impairs the individual with the illness, whether it's a personality disorder, or it's depression, or anxiety, or a substance use disorder. There's always some level of disability involved. In other words, it's not a problem if it doesn't cause problems. But if there's an ongoing mental health problem, and you're asking somebody who has a mental health problem to solve some other problem, like your marital problems, I think that's really unfair. It's like asking somebody who's got a broken leg to run a marathon with you. And that's just not going to work. They're disabled. And if you can recognize this invisible disability that is invisible but nevertheless real, and you can see that it's real because they can't do lots of other things that they normally would have been able to do because of their mental health condition, then you also have to accept that they're not going to be able to engage in the very challenging task of being part of a couple solving life's problems. And I think that's really it. I think marriage counseling, this is why I think counselors, I'm going to interrupt myself by saying, I think this is why counselors need to always screen for mental health problems, even when they're doing marital counseling, because sometimes marital counseling isn't really on deck as the next problem. If two people are each struggling, let's say, with a common mental health problem, like depression and perhaps ADHD, well, then addressing those problems first will then free them up to be more adaptive and to be clearer in their thinking, and then they can go on and solve problems. But, I've thinking back over my past, Jason, I can think of times where I would be trying to have serious conversations with drunk members of my family to solve problems. And looking back on it, I just shake my head at my own feeble-mindedness, because they're so impaired, they can't even freaking drive a car. How are they going to solve challenging life problems with another human being? That's just not possible. Yeah. So solving those problems up first, it's sort of a triage thing, right? But let's assume the listener is with someone who is normal, but they're just not getting along, or they have a difference of opinion, or they have different values, or they were raised differently, and so there's a conflict. I just think that that's going to be resolved so much more easily if they can identify the true nature of the problem, and that the problem is not my spouse. And this is what you usually hear, isn't it? When people get together with their friends and somebody will say, well, what's wrong? My wife, God damn it.
Yeah.
Or my husband. And then there's the eye roll. No, I don't even want to say the words, because I don't want you kids to put your hands over mom's ears anymore. So, if there's any way to make it less personal in the sense of less passionately blaming.
Mm-hmm.
I think that metaphor of the sacred bubble can sometimes be helpful.
Yeah.
I don't use it with everyone because sometimes it's just not helpful. But, if I'm working with a couple and I can look at them and say, well, so Susan, are you really you seem to be absolutely crazy about John. Is that true? Yes, I'm still crazy about him.
Mm-hmm.
And John, are you still crazy about Susan? Oh, of course. And then that they're already there. They've already got the sacred bubble idea in their head. They just don't know quite how to talk about the problem without the blame because of the way they were raised typically.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then would you say then, so somebody who is in a relationship with someone with a personality disorder or some sort of addiction, that you can't do with the bubble with them?
I just think that that's really hard because of the level of impairment. I mean, we're not talking small problems here. Like, I have a mild limp because I injured my ankle running. I mean, this is a major, these mental health diagnoses are extremely significant when it comes to solving all the other problems in life. And so that's why I take mental health really seriously, and why I believe when people are dating or even when they're married for years, they need to be open to the possibility that there might be an invisible problem that they haven't yet recognized. Their partner might be impaired.
And do you do that? Like you mentioned screening for that sort of stuff. Do you do that typically in the first few sessions of
Absolutely.
So if a couple comes to you, you run them through a specific
battery of tests. No, I don't do that. I don't do that because, in terms of.
But can you tell sometimes? You're like, oh, I see this person has.
If you can see the palm, if you can read their palm, you can know everything. No, I think that it's, the most, the biggest, how can I express this? In terms of conducting an epidemiological audit, in other words, looking at what kind of mental health problems most Americans have, the vast majority of Americans have the most common mental health problems. I misspoke. The vast majority of Americans with mental health problems have common problems.
Okay.
They're not rare problems. But if you have somebody who is, you can kind of tell with experience if somebody might be ADHD, or you can pick up or might have be on the spectrum, let's say, and that their partner hasn't picked up on that yet, and they might be taking might be taking something personally that the other person has very little or no control over. And I think I mentioned this couple before where they both came in and they were just fit to be tied. They were so angry and they were talking about a divorce. And they came in for one session, found out they were both ADHD, and that his sloppiness or not picking up his socks off the floor regularly was not a personal dig at her, and her being late for everything was not a dig at him, but they were both ADHD. And then they looked at each other and it was like watching, two people fall in love all over again. I was like, get a room. Come on, get out of my office. And they lived happily ever after. And the same thing.
And how did they get diagnosed that quickly, though? You were able to tell through the...
Oh, sure. Because honestly, I'm asking, in 50 minutes, people don't want to waste time with me. And they're telling me what, how they see the world, how they see each other. And I'll ask a few questions. And then sometimes I'll just say, well, have you ever been diagnosed with any kind of learning disorder? And they'll say, well, they told me I had ADHD back in school, but I told them they were crazy, or something like that. Or they'll just admit, or they'll say, I have this problem, or I'll ask, do you think you might be depressed? And they'll say, usually most people who are depressed will say, yeah. Well, and then the question is, how depressed? Like clinically significantly, or just sad?
Yeah.
Because sadness isn't necessarily such a big problem. People get sad, that's part of normal life. But to be clinically depressed, that's going to impair your ability to think and make judgments and to remember things. All mission critical when you're in therapy working on a relationship.
And then what would you say about people who, I mean, is this something you can incorporate into your intentional interview? And the intentional interview, if you don't know, for listeners, that's like the conversations you have before you get into a committed long-term monogamous relationship. You kind of ask a bunch of questions. Can you bring up the sacred bubble as something that you want to create? Like, is that something people could kind of talk about?
Well, I want to add before we move on that the intentional interview continues. I mean, I've still got lots of questions left for Sharon.
Yeah. So
and she for me, so it's never ending because people are constantly changing. Mm-hmm. But could you weave this into an intentional interview? Absolutely, along the same lines of.
It's almost like fair fighting.
Yes.
But then it's a part of that.
It's a part of that, but it's also a part of the, can you be crazy about me, but still start a reasonable fight with me? You know, that's abuse free.
Yeah. So.
And I think that's, it would be great if we could all do that, because the opposite of love is not anger. Mm-hmm. It's indifference. And when somebody, like, you know, you always brought up one of your failed relationships, and that one where she had already decided a year into it that she was not really, she knew it wasn't right.
Yeah.
And then, but that's kind of weirdly indifferent. You know, she didn't get angry with you there and just say, I gotta get out of this relationship, or this is driving me nuts, or, I mean, that would have been welcome. And if she had brought up whatever the issues were, that would have been welcome.
Yeah.
But she just kept it all to herself.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do that, and that's something I would have done too, to be honest with you, I either, in my younger years, at least, I would err between being too controlling and too critical, or not being brave enough on the other extreme to bring up something that was really making me unhappy. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the balanced place would be being able to talk about whether or not you're happy, not just an absence of sadness like we've talked about before, but are you actually happy in this relationship? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is, well, I'm not sad, well, that means you're not happy. So, you know, to be able to then take a look at that sacred bubble, and what is it outside of that bubble that's keeping you from being happy? If it is outside of the bubble, I mean, for some of us, after being together for way too long with the wrong person, it's just that there is no real sacred bubble, because we're not really a couple. Mm-hmm. We're really just two individuals who are living together.
Yeah. And then that's not really going to go anywhere as far as what you're looking for.
Not unless years later you could imagine yourself falling in love with this person, which I don't think people fall in love through trying. Mm-hmm. Well, I really tried to love him, but I just couldn't. It took me 30 years to figure that out.
Have you had people who have done it that you've told us about, and then they come back and they're like, oh my God, this has helped me so much. It makes it so much easier to not take the problems that I have personally. And
sure, but you know, this is not one of my favorite ideas. It's just an idea. The goal is, it's an example of treating the problems objectively and being able to sit down dispassionately. Some people can just do that out of the gate. They don't need to talk about sacred bubbles or profane bubbles. They don't need to talk about bubbles at all. They just are ready to solve problems and get on with life. And God bless those people. I think they're fantastic.
But there's not many of those people, probably.
I don't think there are too many of those people, at least not around counselors' offices. There usually aren't, because we all have issues. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to think I could always be rational, but looking back over my history, I know that's just not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then, again, with managing love intelligently, practicing this practice of the sacred bubble, if you can't just automatically do it naturally on your own, I think, again, like, it leads to greater intimacy, which is, again, I think the goal out of all of this whole thing about managing love intelligently, to have a truly intimate relationship, which is stuff we've talked about before. That seems to be the most fulfilling reason to get into a relationship is that intimacy, the ending of loneliness. And it's, again, a thing that allows people to do that.
Yes, that's a pretty good summary of everything I'm thinking. And the whole thing about intimacy, right, is the ability to safely share my life with another person. But if I'm, I know people who struggle with their religion, and this metaphor, funny enough, you would think religious people would have this part of life figured out, but many people think of their religion as more important than their marriage or their relationship or the other person that they're married to. And so for them, thinking of it as a sacred bubble is like, oh, this too is a sacred thing. Yeah. It's as sacred as my holy book or as my attendance at my meetings of my faith or anything else. Yeah, this is absolutely sacred, isn't it? When we talk about holy matrimony, and usually with a little bit of encouragement, people who are given to religiosity and to rigidity can see, oh yeah, this is something that I believe is sacred. And I do need to treat it as if it were a sacred responsibility to treat it in a certain way. And so I think it is helpful for some people, but at the end of the day, it's just a metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. It's a reframe of marital conflict that helps people realize the ideas we're in conflict about are actually outside of us.
Yeah,
we can love each other, we can adore each other, we can continue on and having sex and hugging and kissing and all the things that go with that, even if I'm really mad at my partner over something else.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think the simplest ideas are sometimes the most powerful. And when you could even visualize it, I mean, like this, it's like draw two people in a circle holding hands, and then around them write all the problems.
Yeah.
It's like, it's vision. Like when you could break it down like that, I think that's what makes it a good idea. Like it's like the simplicity of it all, because you could visually see it, and then you could intellectually understand it, and then when you put it into practice and you're like, wow, this makes having the relationship a lot easier than the way we were doing things before.
And thus endeth the lesson.
Yeah. Okay, so draw that picture and put it on your refrigerator of you and your partner holding hands, draw a bubble around it, write problems are on the outside.
Yeah, exactly.
That will be a constant reminder.
I think you've got it.
Okay. All right. To wrap things up, we have a listener question. And if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. This week's question is as follows. I heard that the state of Utah has the highest porn use per capita. So I researched it, and there's some conflicting data about, but it was clear that the states with the highest rates of porn use are all conservative and more religious states, which was not what I expected. Why do you think this is?
That's really a whole podcast in itself. I think, let me just say, and this, I know the question isn't about sexual criminality, it's about porn. But when we talk about the profile of the typical sex offender in America, that is 4 words: male, white, above average in education, and religious.
Mm.
So why would that be? Well, I would argue that is a demographic of the most sexually repressed individuals in our country.
Wow.
So women typically, I've noticed when they get together and are talking, they're much more fluid and comfortable, partly because I think their sexuality is so tied to their bodies in terms of menstruation and pregnancy and birth and menopause and all of that. And I think, so that's the male portion of that. I think educated people are really focused on career advancement I mean, I know we all have heard the horror stories of people with advanced degrees doing terrible things, but I think in general that is a group that is able to defer gratification and repress their sexuality for the sake of long-term goals like advancing their career. And then when we start talking about the religious part of that, I think it almost goes without saying, but it may end up needing to have its own podcast, but I've talked about it before. And the reason I'm not religious is because I realized eventually, it took me many decades to figure this out, but that religion, it's not so much that religion is bad or that it's got bad things to say about sexuality, but that it's, when it comes to really understanding human sexuality, religion is truly irrelevant. It really is not informative. It's a little bit like, for me to look for answers in religion is like me as a 13-year-old in 7th grade looking in the dictionary for bad words. It's not really sexually stimulating to look up the word breast in the dictionary. I was wondering what they were going to say. I was maybe hoping, something interesting would happen, but it's really not that helpful when we look at it. And I think there's just, our society, our species has moved on culturally so far beyond what religion has to say about human sexuality that it's really unhelpful. And one of the biggest pieces of that is, whether it's Utah or some other place in the Bible Belt that really promotes religion or a religious viewpoint of strictly politically secular issues, I think that we get to a place with religion where the rules and the revelations matter more than the people the rules and the revelations are meant to serve. And that creates enormous problems, pulling us out of reality and disjoining us from the reality of the earth we live in. So there really are gay people. And they are real people, and they are real citizens. And yet when we preach irrationally against that reality, we are spending Lord knows how many hours wasting time fighting something that's as genuine as the force of gravity. So fighting human sexuality and keeping it is marked by keeping it secretive. And the old saying in therapy, I think it might even come from AA, is we are as sick as we are secretive. And pornography is not usually a family event where we enjoy in crowds. So that's my take on that.
Great. Well, depends on the family, I was going to say.
Oh, please, let's not go down that road. Okay. Oh my gosh.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the question. And thanks, Steve, as always. And have a great one, everyone.
Yeah. Bye now.